most American companies promote American values and project them
Democracy.
overseas. Things like freedom of speech, for example, which was a major problem with Facebook in countries like Malaysia or something, where you're kind of like, what should like the First Amendment apply in Malaysia? It's not in their constitution.
Hello and welcome to a new edition of Connecting the Dots with Sebastian Cochinescu. Today I have with me Alex Chitea, and I'm going to introduce him because I have some nice words written here. He's a passionate technologist at heart and by training. He's been building his career at the intersection of innovation, technology, and business. Alex is the founder and managing partner at Funston Capital, a private investment firm looking to acquire and grow a single business over the long term. Funston Capital is backed by a strong team of institutional and individual investors and partners, including current or former CEOs, board members, and experienced SME investors. Before Funston, Alex was a principal with Orange, a global telecommunications company, where he focused on investment and research activities in cybersecurity. Alex graduated from the University of Chicago Booth's MBA program, where he was a recipient of the Dean's Award and also completed Stanford's Innovation and Entrepreneurship Certificate. Prior to his MBA, he was a software engineer at Google in San Francisco, during which time he completed the CFA Charter Holder program, and also Alex holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in computer science. So pretty impressive resume there, Alex. You're hired.
Thank you.
Welcome to Connecting the Dots.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We're gonna have some interesting discussion today. So I'll just start with a quick question that I like to ask everyone, which is, what is your life journey? I mean, you have a resume here, you know how these things are, but I'm curious on what was or what is your life's journey. I know you come from Romania originally,
right,
but you end up in San Francisco, you live there now, you work there now, and how was that journey for you so far?
Yeah, that's so thank you for the invite. It's really great to be here. I really appreciate it. So as you said, born and raised in Bucharest, Romania. Left immediately after high school and moved to Germany initially. I studied for computer science. I did a bachelor's and a master's there at the Max Planck Institute. And immediately after, I got drafted by Google and moved to work in California.
What position?
As a software engineer, mostly working on the search engine initially, and then eventually I transitioned into YouTube. Out of all places. I think the thing that sort of marked my life journey, if you will, was what's come to be known the Great Recession of 2008. So the financial crisis that sort of started.
So when was that? When you were drafted to Google?
I started my... so I did an internship with them in 2006 and then came back full time in 2007. And unbeknownst to me, the economy was starting to, be on shaky grounds, like September 2007, and then sort of blew out in 2008. So that was a pivotal moment because at that point I became interested in finance, and specifically I became interested in what I later, discovered was a thing called global macro, because there were all these people around me that I was reading in the news, like Bridgewater's Ray Dalio, George Soros, and a few other global macro thinkers. And it seemed very interesting to me how they were able to sort of presciently predict what was happening around
I've
us
seen that
a few years before.
In the last couple of months, at least, that people in the crypto space, at least, are very interested in macro all of a sudden.
I think everybody is a macro investor right now. Because we're going, and we're gonna touch on this. Like we're going through a macro moment a little bit. But yeah, so that was what was pivotal for me, because at that point I sort of realized I was doing the job of a software engineer, but I got interested in finance and sort of started studying for finance, and eventually ended up pivoting out of engineering and out of technology for a little bit, and went the sort of MBA route, studied economics, studied finance, went to New York, and then eventually found my way back to Silicon Valley around 2016. So I would say that's sort of my life journey, and
that's an interesting mix
in a nutshell. But that's
technology
the reason
and economy. Great.
Right.
So then that leads me to my next question, which is, what are you passionate about?
So on On the personal side, I would say I'm passionate in like music and creative arts in general, and like making music and technology. Of course, I work in technology. I've been involved with technology from a very young age, and then economics and macroeconomics specifically. And sometimes these three things sort of intersect. Sometimes pairwise, two of them, and sometimes all three. So as I said, I'm interested in music. I have a music studio with like synthesizers and stuff like that. And like last year and the year before that, all of that got affected by the semiconductor chip shortage
Yeah.
and supply chain. So that was kind of like technology intersecting music, intersecting macroeconomics. But oftentimes they tend to be pretty separate, and sometimes they do intersect like that. But that's pretty much what where my passions lie.
These are some interesting traits in a person. I mean, to be at the confluence of technology and art in general, let's say, or creativity. That's something that you do not find that often.
I find, software engineering and just engineering in general is such a sort of mental exercise, and specifically software engineering is something that like happens a lot in your brain before
Code is poetry,
before
right?
you sort of put it down, and I find that a lot of people who are into that sort of field, they tend to want to do something with their hands as well, and other senses, right? Not just the brain. So it's I wouldn't say it's like like I'm so special, because I've seen people like doing like things like pottery or sword making and things like that. That sort of
Creative.
software engineers that basically go and do things with their hands outside work, right? Primarily because as humans, like we love to sort of engage with all of our senses and not just be thinking machines.
Right, and as I said, coding is poetry at some
Yeah.
extent. So there's a question I used to ask my students at the university, and what makes you wake up in the morning, or what keeps you awake at night, or and don't answer please the alarm clock. So what drives you, right? That's the main question.
I think there's this passion about, like building new things and sort of learning what's out there. And I think we sort of live in this environment where, like everything is just a click away, and people that are naturally curious, like they're driven by that curiosity. So for me, I'm a very autodidact person. I like to study by myself. I like to sort of go down rabbit holes. And fortunately or unfortunately, because sometimes it can be like a time sinkhole. Everything is out there.
So what's your latest rabbit hole that you went?
Well, the latest rabbit hole for me has been music, like both financially and time, in terms of time consumption. So, and it will continue to be. And what I've noticed, like time and time again in my life, is that this sort of interests that I develop, they tend to level up at some point. So like you basically like going down a rabbit hole, you learn a lot, you maybe you definitely consume time, but sometimes you consume money. And then it sort of levels off and sort of becomes a part of you, becomes, like a part of who
then
you are.
Move to the next one, right?
Yeah, you move on to the next one, or, like it sort of, it becomes part of, like your thinking and applying your thinking to other areas of your life as well.
Well, that's interesting. Music, out of all things, it's Bitcoin could be another one, right?
I guess, like some, like like, yeah, circa 2015, 2016, I went down that rabbit hole, like the, AR, VR, metaverse. And like, like I like to read a lot broadly on just, technology in general is a fascinating and sort of endless subject as well.
So you were focused on macro economics before it was cool, before crypto, before everything else. So I was wondering, how do you see this mixture, this connection to macro trends and cryptocurrencies, or blockchain in general?
So blockchain is something that sort of I specifically don't have any like solid opinion on. It's kind of like one of those things, like what I've learned in life, and also, like from watching this, like better people than myself, do investing, is sometimes you sort of have to invest in things on the assumption that just you're dumb and you're not understanding certain aspects. Like I did dive into sort of the technology behind blockchain, but there are certain things that I, like agree and disagree with from what what I've seen, like people, the tribe in that area sort of explain. But it's still sort of, you still want to have like a little bit of a play, so to speak, right? So like I do have certain, like Ether, for example, has been like one of the projects that I've been supporting financially, personally, for a very long time. And the reason behind that was mostly sort of, seeing Vitalik and kind of what he stands for, what he wants to do, and so on and so forth. And just investing on the basis that, like, here's a guy that's much smarter than me. I may or may not understand everything that he's saying. So, like, let him deal with that, and just like try not to kind of like do momentum around it, or, like try to, gauge the market. So that's kind of like how I'm looking at it, like from a sort of political standpoint. I think that's kind of like where, like the whole decentralization thesis of, like blockchain, that's kind of where it's basically going to see the most pushback from governments, and even the companies that succeeded in that space, like Coinbase. I think it's a prime example of a good sort of public company. It basically is, at the end of the day, a central structure with a CEO. So I think, like out of this area that's now been rebranded Web3, as of late, like we're going to see some companies emerge, but I don't think they're going to live up to the ideals of the, of the initial sort of founders of the movement, right? So they're not gonna live up to the entire philosophy, in the same way the internet, right, like did not live up to the philosophy of the sort of cyberpunks of yesteryear, right? Like it's become something else, and usually what happens is you have this sort of revolutionary thinkers that come in with like groundbreaking ideas, and then eventually the technology or area takes a life of its own, and then those guys disappear again into the fringes, because they're just like, like they love being at the fringes, so like they'll probably go on to the next thing. So that's kind of how I see it.
In blockchain, there are these two currents, let's say. One is the Bitcoin maximalists that believe in Satoshi's vision, and that's the only thing that matters. And on the other hand, you have Vitalik and the other coiners, let's say, that think that these two worlds can coexist. So it's normal for this to happen. And I was just wondering, besides the fact that you might have invested or you think it's a risky investment, what's your take maybe on the libertarianism level of new CryptoPunks and crypto trends?
Sorry, I don't even want to touch on that one. Like I try to. Like politics has become so charged on all sides of the, of the political spectrum, and very divided, especially in the United States, but also in other countries, like around Western Europe and so on, as we've seen with like the elections in Italy and whatnot last year. So I try to stay out of that equation, like altogether. There's too much passion, and I think, it's sort of in a way, unfortunately, it's become like it's reached a point where, like dialogue cannot happen, and at the same time you cannot solve the problems without the dialogue, and it's, because they're too far apart.
It's more and more difficult. So then let's move then to a more quiet, let's say, area, which would be investing. I mean, you're living and breathing these topics. So what are you looking at in a startup when investing?
Right. So I, like for the past couple of years, I've been looking a lot at the sort of lower to middle market private equity markets in the US. So that's been my, my day to day, and that's a little bit different than, than pure startup investing. And but I can go back a little bit, and we can discuss a little bit, like high level, and then dive deep a little bit into startup investing. I think it's a loaded question. It's a very complex question, because it depends on a host of factors. Specifically, like the stage of the company, that, like the industry, the business model, like you invest in one way in something like a SaaS business model.
Do you have a process
versus something else? There's, there's always sort of the like the two schools of thought, like you have the sort of market people, the ones that are looking at what's, like what's the market that the company's attacking. And then you have the team and product people. And I can double click on both of these and explain you my thought process. So the market, famously, Don Valentine, founder of Sequoia, was believed to be in favor of thinking about markets first and then teams second. And the idea behind that was that you can change anything about a startup, including the founding team, but you cannot change the market that it operates in. And also, you can most technology companies try to create new markets, and sometimes a market doesn't want to be created. So you can bang your head against the wall if there's no indication that there's sort of a break and have a market start. You cannot force a market into existence, right? And I think Warren Buffett also has a quote around that where he basically says that, and I'm paraphrasing here, like when a team with a stellar management reputation meets a company with a reputation for bad economics, it's the company that keeps its reputation intact. And sometimes that sort of, like the market sort of sets the parameters, the performance envelope, if you will, of what a company can do. You can hallucinate around it, and investors have done that in the past, and think that certain companies are beyond, like market fundamentals. And we've seen that, with companies like WeWork that work sort of, in the real estate space, or office real estate space, and they were thought to be, like tech companies just because they were hosting tech firms. And like Uber, for example, like being beyond the sort of, taxi ride sharing, and then eventually they've come down to the economics of the industry, right?
But I guess that's because we have a precedent with Steve Jobs that bended the reality and famously said that people don't know what they want. And so you have Y Combinator on one hand, where you should build something that people want, and you have Steve Jobs on the other hand that says people have no idea what they want. You should create a market for them. And because it was so successful, I mean, that's, I think, why this tendency exists to say that if there's no market, you can always create one. But what people forget is that Steve Jobs comes once in a lifetime, right? So you can't really emulate Steve Jobs.
But there's a tendency of mimicry, and like I've seen a lot of people mimic, like the sort of the outside forms of things, like, I don't know, like the Elizabeth Holmes wearing turtlenecks and things like that. So like you always have a tendency of people to sort of, play the image and thinking that, like this fake it till you make it attitude, and
the reality.
It's gonna, but coming back to the sort of the market idea, I think, like when you look at any company, you can break that down a little bit into two questions, when you're talking about a technology company. One is, any technology usually gets cheaper and better with time. So you want to understand, like how much cheaper and how much better this technology can get. And the second one, which is very important, is who's going to use that technology once it gets cheaper and better. So the first adopters are the first adopters, and they're a group of their own, a special group of people with their own sort of, psychographics, I would say. But who's, like, how does the technology look when your mother or your grandmother is using
crossing
it?
The chasm. Yeah.
So those two questions are really important for the market. And then if you want to dive into sort of the product side of the equation, like the team and product, I would say three things are really important to me when I look at a company. So one is basically the data that the company is generating through the course of its operations, or if they have some, unique insight data that they are building their company upon. The expertise that's in the business, and that can be domain expertise. I think it's really important. You oftentimes see people starting companies, I don't know, in the medical field, and they don't have a, like a doctor to guide them or whatever, and, like they usually fail. And then the sort of the secret sauce, right? The secret sauce can be an algorithm, a process that binds the data, brings the domain expertise to the data, right? So those three things I think are really, really important.
So then I have to ask that, what would be the most important factor in startup investing? So you're as I said, you may have a process, of course, but what's more important for you, like networking or negotiations or education or gut feelings, or what do you think is the most important thing that guides you as an investor in picking a startup?
I think building a great product, right? Like at the end of the day, you can fake many things in life, but you cannot fake.
And how do you measure that's great?
The actual, well, like, does it meet a need in the market? Like, is that need something real? Is it, like that people would be willing to spend money for? There are a lot of companies out there that build great things that sort of are valuable, but they are not able to extract that value for themselves, right? They're just like, it almost becomes like this externality, you would call it in economics, right? Where it's just something that's good for society, but, like Twitter, right? Like it's good to have that discourse, that, open discourse. Well, I mean, arguably some people don't think it's good, but, so it creates a lot of, like positive and negative externalities at the same time, a little bit in the case of Twitter, but they haven't been able to sort of like capture that value monetarily.
So that's a generic thing that applies to most startups.
I think it does, yeah.
I was wondering, you were during your Orange time focused on B series, on investing in companies with a ticket of $15 million or more. And that's a whole different animal, let's say. So you already know that company when you talk about Series B, you know that it has traction, it's well positioned within the market. So then how would you pick between those? I mean, it's a lot difficult to...
So I think, like cybersecurity, which was kind of the area that I was looking into, is like a little bit of an animal in and of itself. And I think that's sort of the reason why a lot of people, like specialize in certain, verticals. Specifically for that, I think, like most companies are in need of cybersecurity products, but there's sort of a priority, like a priority of needs of what they must address in their day-to-day business. And then basically the game there was sort of matching what the company does to the actual needs of a chief security officer or CISO in a company. And you evidently want it to be in like the, like top 3 or top 5 needs. Fundamentally, even you could definitely build, like a top 10 or top 15 address a need in that like in that sphere, but you might not be bought because even though a company is, let's say, losing money to a certain problem that they're having, if that problem is sort of manageable from a financial standpoint and it's not as hot on their list, they might not choose. So there the game was, like try to understand, like what this company is doing in terms of like what's required in the market. And that was like an ever-changing game. So I would say, like that's kind of how most decisions in that space are made.
So you were basically picking companies out of the cybersecurity pool and getting them to the next level, of course. But why would be then cybersecurity so important? I mean, it could be a self-explanatory answer to that, but what's your take? Why is cybersecurity so important nowadays?
Well, so I think, like I would take a step back and try to look at cybersecurity in the context of the sort of history of technology, if you will. And what we see over the sort of history of humanity and history of technology is that when humans master a new medium through technology, war usually follows within that medium. So that's how I look at it. So for example, let's talk specifics. When we sort of invented the airplane, we took to fighting in the skies. You invented the, like the ships, you took to fighting on the seas, and so on and so forth, right? So cyberspace is sort of the latest invention, and it's sort of the one that has one of the largest footprints, right? Like I think in 2023, I read the statistic somewhere that says something like 6.8 billion people are going to have a smartphone in their pockets. So that's, that's prone to a cyber attack. So you have this large, you have this large footprint and like addressable market, I would say, for the criminals in the space. That's an area where criminals can attack. Now, the difference with sort of conventional warfare and cyber warfare is that cyber warfare affects all of us, right? Conventional warfare is governed by international law. You sort of have a military fighting another military. So the collateral damages are a little bit contained in a way, right? I mean, there's always collateral damage. You cannot minimize it. But we've been doing it enough that we basically wrote international laws of like rules of engagement and things like that. There are no rules of engagement for cyber war. So all of us can be a target, right? So like if you're in a hospital in Atlanta and some like Russians at the FSB take over the hospital, you can be a collateral damage. You can be a target just by being a patient, right? So that's why cybersecurity, I would say, is like really important in today's world because it affects all of us, and all of us can become a target of it.
And hopefully keeps us safe. So that leads me to the next question, which would be, you mentioned Word, you mentioned cybersecurity. So
Right.
then what is the role of tech diplomacy, and what's your take on this?
So I think, tech diplomacy is really important in the context of, like the tech companies having become sort of international, like holding a lot of influence and power over, like politics, over global politics, right? So we've seen that being acknowledged by countries. So for example, I believe it was around 2016, 2017 when Denmark opened its first office of a tech ambassador in Silicon Valley. And the idea behind that was you have these companies like Google, Apple, Facebook that are basically involved with the lives of their citizens, closely. So you sort of want to have, like some representative of your country to kind of like discuss directly with the CEOs of these companies that in and of themselves have become a little bit like heads of state. So that's part of it, and you've seen it even recently. Like last year with the war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, where like somebody like Elon Musk basically can provide Starlink assistance to a country. So I think like tech diplomacy should definitely go both ways, from countries to companies, but also companies to countries. It used to like. Companies usually also have lobbyists and stuff like that, so that's like another channel. But more dialogue is definitely necessary between countries and these companies that sort of affect our lives.
I know that Microsoft has a strong footprint in Russia, but on the other hand, it's helping Ukraine a lot in their
Right.
war efforts. So these companies, these mammoths, or have something in common. They do not have physical borders. They are
Exactly.
registered somewhere, basically mostly in the United States, but they transcend physical borders. And I think that's something that it's very interesting to see how it folds out, because you can't have something that is above a state or a nation, but on the other hand, you have them already, and
Right.
they transcend the states.
Yeah, and you see a lot of like sort of ethical, if you will, or moral questions being asked already. Like what does like most American companies promote American values and project them
Democracy.
overseas. Things like freedom of speech, for example, which was a major problem with Facebook in countries like Malaysia or something, where you're kind of like what like should like the First Amendment apply in Malaysia? It's not in their constitution. So you sort of have this, and vice versa now, in a sort of ironic twist of fate, where the U.S. is kind of getting a taste of their own medicine with TikTok and ByteDance, where like certain foreign interests, like get applied to the U.S. So like. How is that gonna
or Google in China
gonna square, or Google in China, which sort of had a very strenuous relationship with China. It sort of went in, came out, went back in. So yeah, it's interesting.
So that leads me to the question: are we living in a post-truth era?
I think we are. I think we
Okay.
are. I think unfortunately this is kind of like one of the side effects of the social networks is they amplify this like this confirmation bias in people, where we're, like what we read and the bubbles that we're in form our, truth in a way. There was this very sort of famous exchange between, I think, Kellyanne Conway, who's like a counselor to President Trump, when they were doing they were debating how many people attended the inauguration of President Trump. at some point she basically said, like they were arguing over the number of people, right?
Yeah.
And it was kind of like said to be higher than it appeared in pictures. And eventually she acknowledged, like it is so, but we choose to believe that it was, higher. So, and I'm paraphrasing that, but yeah, so yes, we are in many, many ways, everybody's living their own truth. And I think that's kind of like true in life in general, but yeah, things that were sort of immutable before have become, like very loose today.
So, besides the fact that one might ask, what is the truth? I would like to pinpoint here that it's going to be a lot more difficult from now on because of ChatGPT and OpenAI and this kind of bots that will make it more and more difficult for us to actually pinpoint misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and these kind of things. And cyber war will become a lot trickier to be fought. So let's go back a bit to entrepreneurship and to your expertise into that domain. I would like to ask you, as I said, you were investing in the B series, and now you're actually with your fund focusing on companies that are maybe to their to that point too. What would be the role of a late stage investor in the growth of a company? If a company makes, I don't know, 5, 10, $20 million a year, do they still need, and why do they still need an investor, institutional investor, and how would that growth look in a later stage company?
Right. So I think there are, different schools of thought amongst VCs, there are people who are basically saying, like, if you have a portfolio of companies, just like let the ones that are doing well do well, and just try to focus your efforts on sort of helping the ones that are not doing well. There are others who sort of go the other way, where they're basically saying, oh, the ones that are not doing well, there's nothing you can do to kind of like
let them die,
make them do well. So just focus on the ones that that do well, and try to make them perform even better. I think there was definitely a paradigm shift with around the early 2010s, with the formation of Andreessen Horowitz in Silicon Valley, where Andreessen Horowitz, it sort of was inspired or adapted the Hollywood talent agency model that was defined by a talent agency called CAA, Creative Artists Agency. And that specific agency, what they innovated in the realm of talent agencies was that they packaged deals for media companies, right? So if you wanted to do a TV show, they would basically look within the pool of talent that they were managing, and they would pull out a writer, a director, a lead actor,
a recipe.
So they had everything, and they were selling it to you as a package, right? So Andreessen himself, being like friends with the people who sort of innovated this model, took it and adapted it for venture capital. And before Andreessen Horowitz, companies had a handful of employees. Most of them were general partners, and most of them were sort of directly investing and overseeing the companies they invested in. So that was the paradigm, right? And then Andreessen comes along and basically hires a lot of people that become experts in certain fields, that nurture relationships with big companies. And essentially, when they invest in a company, they sort of allow you to plug into that network and have deal partners and people, inside Andreessen that can, open a door for you at a company like General Electric and help you with your business development and so on and so forth. So that has been the paradigm in which a lot of the sort of late stage investors have basically helped these companies, was by putting them in front of, like this larger buyers at the right time, right? So, so I would say that's it's been copied and replicated.
It's been working well.
It's been working well for the people who did it. There are other firms that sort of decided to maintain like the small kind of like small group of partners. Like benchmark capital is one of them, where they basically stayed small on purpose, and they haven't followed that model. But again, VC is sort of an evolving asset class and paradigm, so we'll probably see it evolve.
So you at Funston Capital, you have a fund of private equity, right?
Right, I have private equity investors.
I was wondering, maybe you can just in a couple of words explain what's the difference between private equity and regular VCs, and what's the model that you're applying. So what that gives you basically a more space for deciding, or what's the main difference?
Yeah, so I would say the main difference, between venture capital is that in venture capital, you're venturing. You're basically taking a risk on an idea, a team, a product that's not, maybe doesn't, definitely sometimes doesn't have product market fit yet, right? It needs money to get off the ground and make it into the market. So I think that's the sort of the essence of venture capital. Now, venture capital itself sort of evolved over time. So these larger companies that we were speaking about in recent earlier, they've raised a lot of funds that they've become sort of asset allocators in a sense. So, and actually Andreessen became an RIA, which gives them the right to invest in sort of public equities as well. So the model is sort of, like murky now on the VC side, but fundamentally it was supposed to be, like venturing into sort of something unknown. Private equity, on the other hand, is more of a, like exercise in financial engineering, if you will, right? You're basically taking a company that definitely has product market fit. You're taking a company that is profitable, has, like steady growth, healthy margins, and you're trying to sort of make it better, right? Now, within private equity, you sort of have other areas, like distressed investing, where you're basically taking companies that are not doing that well and trying to turn them around. Yeah. But the main difference, I would say, is it's an established company. It's got product market fit. It's got a known quantity product and known customers, and you're basically going in to make it better.
That sounds like brick and mortar.
Not necessarily. Like they can definitely, they can be brick and mortar. They can be, like sort of old economy. They can be new economy as well. There are a lot of companies that have been funded by venture capital firms and never sort of reached the escape velocity of what a venture capital firm would have wanted. Like they didn't reach, I don't know, like 100x, like they didn't return 100x. So they're just kind of like maintaining, and they might have like a good technical product and a good team, and they're just kind of like, cruising along, doing what they do and having a market for their thing. And they might not return like sort of VC model. They might not have VC model returns, but they could potentially be good private equity targets. So we see a lot of private equity companies coming into the sort of VC market and acquiring these companies. And since we were speaking about cybersecurity before, Thoma Bravo, which is like a very large private equity firm, has been acquiring a lot of interesting assets within the cybersecurity space off of VCs oftentimes. So like a lot of the companies had been funded by VCs. So
that's a nice dynamic.
Yeah, it's a nice dynamic between, like there's definitely overlap. And I think just in general, over the last few years, you've seen a lot of companies like, I don't know, Tiger Global, for example, coming into the VC market out of, private equity. And then everybody has been sort of also moving into the public equities market. And I think Andreessen themselves sort of innovated again there by transforming themselves into a registered investment advisor, RIA, a couple or maybe 3 years ago today. I don't know, like the pandemic is making all the dates kind of, yeah.
So I have to ask then, there are two questions that I'd like to blend, and one would be, what trends do you see in technology? And then I would mix it with the question of, what areas do you focus with your private equity fund right now? So what probably you want to see the next trends. So what are the next trends?
Right.
And what are you interested in investing right now?
Right. So so on the trends, so let's take them one by one. I think on the trend side, it's, you know, like you don't have to be a macroeconomist kind of like understand that we're sort of living through a macroeconomic moment. And I think, you know, there's always been change, but some changes are more important than others. And I think we're sort of living through, you know, some generationally defining trends and changes, right? So if 2022 was sort of the year of inflation, 2023 is it brings some like readjustment within the tech sector. I would say there are kind of like three main trends that we're seeing, sort of at the macro level, and then I'm going to dive into like a few of the sort of technology trends. But at the macro level, we have the deglobalization, decoupling, if you will, of the sort of East and West. That was started, you know, like before the pandemic, the trade wars between, you know, the U.S. and China. The pandemic accelerated that. We've seen a lot of reshoring of industries. We've seen a lot of friendshoring, where, you know, like industries came to countries that were sort of helping and you know, like being friendly to the Western countries. So that decoupling that's been accelerated between the East and West, it doesn't look like it's going to abate. The war of last year sort of falls within that. I don't see right now a way of, you know, a path back to kind of like how the whole world looked before the war.
Geopolitics.
Yeah, and then, you know, like the U.S. is actually accelerating its trade war with China. China has some internal instability. So I would say that in and of itself is like a really interesting, you know, like trend. The second is, you know, like this slowdown in growth that was sort of the slowdown in the economy coupled with that inflation. So you're seeing people now, you know, like thinking that, you know, mid 2023 we're going to have mild recessions. Some people are arguing for a soft landing.
You're an optimist.
You know, like there's a spectrum of opinions, you know, ranging from stagflation, which is like a stagnation of the economy, coupled with the high inflation, to sort of, you know, inflation is going to abate and we're going to be able to reach a soft landing. The U.S. economy hasn't reached a soft landing since 1994. So anecdotally and historically, I don't know if they're going to be able to sort of orchestrate that well. But I guess we'll have to kind of like see. And I don't think a lot of the sort of you know, like a lot of the things that are happening are in the control of the central banks. You know, for example, the war and like all the disruptions in the supply chains and things like that have generated the high inflation. They're not necessarily under the control of you know, the sort of monetary institutions. So that's, you know, that I would say that's the you know, this sort of like inflation is the second sort of macro trend that we're seeing. There's another thing that I read recently about called greenflation. So like we're sort of, as we're moving towards this sort of green revolution and renewable energy, you know, like there's a lot of there are a lot of investments that need to be made, and that basically is going to generate this sort of greenflation. And the last thing is basically the sort of readjustment that we're seeing within the tech sector, and sort of the one of the symptoms has been the layoffs that we've seen in recent, you know, like months at the large tech companies. The view there is that, you know, the era of free money is over. Valuations are coming down in the startups. The startups that didn't do well are disappearing. The other startups that are doing well, they're not going to be as focused on growth. They're going to be more focused on sort of achieving profitability and, you know, reducing their burn rates. And the optimist view in that scenario is that all of these people that are sort of being laid off right now are going to trickle down into the economy, are going to trickle down into the startups, and they're going to generate the next
That's an opportunity.
The next generation of startups. So those are kind of like the macro, you know, like I would say the macro trends. If we want to talk about the technology trends, I think we're sort of at the beginning of a new cycle, but we don't know how that cycle is going to look like. So everybody's sort of searching a little bit. So we had the last cycle, which was, I would say, you know, like 2010 to 2020, or like if you want to pull it down a little bit, maybe 2006, 2007 to 2020. That cycle has been built on sort of the combination of cloud and mobile. You had the sort of invention of the iPhone and the release of the iPhone in June of 2007, started selling that fall. The fall of 2007, AWS came on the market in March of 2006. Those two technologies sort of combined around 2010, and then a lot of people sort of started building on top of that technology stack with the sort of iPhone as the container of software, and then the cloud computing as the underlying technology, right? So now we're sort of, there's still companies being built, like within that paradigm, but it's sort of ran its course like the S curve, and we're sort of, plateauing a little bit, and everybody's sort of looking for what the next cycle is going to look like. And if you follow the money and you look at what the, what the big VCs have raised funds for, during the pandemic, there was this exploration of the Web3 that we talked about. So there was a lot of money raised by companies, again, like Andreessen and others, that invested heavily in that. Some of that money came undone, like we've seen the sort of, like the fall of FTX and other companies that are not doing, they're not giving a good reputation to the field. And then the other big one I would say was sort of the metaverse, and that was something that sort of became like a buzzword. I don't know, like right now it's not quite the platform that people had hoped for. So we'll see where that goes. Like there's talk right now that Apple might release and the
Facebook bet. I mean, it's an expensive bet, right?
It's a very expensive bet. So we'll see where that goes. But everybody sort of is searching for this new platform. The money was there for these two. There's been a lot of money raised for bio funds. So we're gonna, I think we're gonna see, and there's been a lot of red tape that was kind of slashed during the Trump presidency to kind of like get to the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. So I think there's going to be a lot of, in the sort of life sciences, medical field, healthcare, there's a lot of money that was raised for that, and there's going to be a lot of sort of innovation. And then you have...
You mean CRISPR, like technologies?
So CRISPR, I think it's already out there and it's just getting applied and refined and getting better. But other things as well, like in the sort of neuromodulation, there are a lot of interesting things, diagnostics specifically,
How about BMI?
Diagnostics, therapeutics.
Brain-machine interfaces.
Ooh, I think that's too far out.
Yeah, not yet.
Like right now, yeah, I don't know. And it's, like there are a lot of technologies in there that have sort of ethical, moral implications. So there's going to be like a huge conversation in society around them. And the last one is basically sort of this large models, GPT, Chat GPT, GPT-3, and
AGI.
And yeah, so sort of artificial intelligence, essentially, a little bit democratized and like working. So this could be a viable platform that people could build on, I think in the near term. And then if you want to talk about sort of like things that are still out there, like things like quantum have, like there's been a lot of money invested in that area, and some reasonable progress made as well.
Especially in cybersecurity. So you live in San Francisco, right? And we've actually met there. And you have local opinion on the next question. So is the Bay Area, is Silicon Valley dead? There is this rumor going on that everyone is moving to Texas, to Austin, to whatever. And what's your take on that? What have you seen living there for the last decades or so?
Yeah, so I think, that San Francisco has always been historically, from the gold rush on, like a boom and bust down. And every time the boom busts, it's, like everybody writes it off. And when things go well, people assume they're going better than they are.
How many obituaries have been written for San Francisco so far?
Right. And then when things don't go that well, people also go, like to more extreme than things are. So I would take that with a grain of salt. It's really hard to predict, evidently. I still believe there's fundamental knowledge that's coming out of the Bay Area in general, not just San Francisco. Again, as I said, like the 2010 to 2020 cycle that was built on cloud and mobile, it had a side effect. And the side effect of that was that you sort of had this enabling technology, and coming back to what I was saying before with the sort of data expertise and secret sauce algorithms binding the two, there was expertise that you could bundle into this tech paradigm, right? And that expertise existed in other cities as well. So if you take a city like LA, they had a lot of media and entertainment expertise. If you take a city like New York, they had a lot of financial services and media, amongst others, expertise, and so on and so forth. So you didn't necessarily need to develop, some deep technology, because you already had it in the form of the mobile and cloud, but you needed that expertise. So basically, we've seen those cities kind of like rise up and become tech hubs where they weren't before, and putting that expertise into this paradigm of cloud and mobile. Now, with the sort of the new era, as I said, we're sort of at the beginning of a new cycle. I'm not seeing sort of fundamental
Decline.
fundamental research coming out of any of these places like LA or New York or Austin, right? So we're not seeing anything fundamentally coming out of them, but we're still seeing some stuff coming out of Silicon Valley, right? So we are, AI, evidently, it's all over, and CRISPR is basically a creation of Berkeley and Harvard in Boston. So there are other kind of like neuroscience projects that are happening at Stanford that are starting to be commercialized that are really interesting from a medical standpoint. Moderna, Silicon Valley, but arguably the best sort of innovation of 2021 was the COVID vaccine.
So the future is not that grim.
So I think the future,
For Silicon Valley.
depends a lot on the on the sort of fundamental technologies that are coming out, right? And quantum, right? There's a company out of Berkeley, Rigetti Computing. There are a few other companies that I know of in both Boston and Palo Alto that are doing some interesting things in quantum. Evidently, Google is doing interesting things there. You have all the sort of self-driving cars at Google and Cruise and other companies. So we're seeing a lot of fundamental technologies, like fundamental science being developed around Silicon Valley that is not necessarily coming out of New York University, right? So I, it's hard to say, right? Or like Miami or Austin or other areas, right? So it's hard to say, but I think eventually the new companies are going to be built on this fundamental technology. Now, are they going to be based in Silicon Valley, or is Silicon Valley going to sort of become a sort of New York, right? Like you go there to financially like raise your money, and then you sort of go and build it somewhere else because it's become expensive. And I think that kind of like I've heard voices within Silicon Valley that are sort of arguing for that, right? Like because the Bay Area has San Francisco Bay Area, because I think there's Seattle Bay Area as well,
right?
But San Francisco Bay Area has has been sort of born, starting companies, but then at some point sort of those companies need to go, onto the NASDAQ, and sort of there's this disconnect at some point in the life of a company where it sort of goes into a financial center. And I've seen people like Mark Andreessen come and say, we need to close that loop. Like why don't we, have that part, like we take them all the way to the door. Like, let's just, not hand them over, but have the whole life cycle of a company. So it might be that San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, because of the sort of high cost of living and whatnot, like, the dream of starting a company in a garage is kind of dead, right? Like it costs too much. The garage costs too much right now. So, so it might be that it becomes this sort of, financial tech hub, like tech financial hub, or like financial tech hub. However you want to put those two words together.
We'll just have to see how this plays out. So I would like to end our interesting discussion here. We kind of haven't touched on everything that I wanted to, but I guess we are limited by time. So I'd like to just close up by asking you, what would be your advice for young tech entrepreneurs, and maybe you have some book recommendations?
Sure. So I think, like the worst vice is advice. So I'm really, I don't like it when like very successful people, not like me, but like very successful people start dispensing advice, like they're successful in one endeavor, and then they sort of tell you how to raise your kids and
Yeah.
have opinions on education and like how to govern a country. So
That's why my question was very specific, just on how what would be your piece of advice for young entrepreneurs?
yeah, so I think like ambitious people tend to sort of build on the outside a lot, and they sort of become imbalanced. So I think like just in general in life is good to sort of, as much as you build outside, build inside as well. So I would say that's kind of like
Focus on yourself.
yeah, every other advice would be anecdotal. I don't think it applies, honestly. And in terms of books, like I want to sort of close the loop with my my interest in music. A person that I've admired my sort of ever since I found out about him has been Rick Rubin, who's a great music producer. He's been the producer of one of my favorite bands, they're the Chili Peppers. And he's recently come out of his shell a little bit and become more, like of a public persona. And he just put out a book like a couple, maybe like even last week, I think like mid-January 2023. And it's called The Creative Act, A Way of Being. And I think, like that sort of creativity is like, how to channel creativity and what the act of creation is. I think it's a really great book, and just reading that. And if you want to kind of like learn more about him and his philosophy, there's also a Showtime documentary that you can rent or buy on Amazon about him. So I would definitely recommend those two. And again, I think the lessons there could apply to multiple facets of life.
So Alex, thank you for being here today. It was great having you on the Connecting the Dots with Sebastian Cochinescu show, and I'm just eager to have you again, maybe in a short while here again.
Thank you so much. It was great being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Cheers.